So we are left with about, yeah, so it says that we are live on YouTube. With your permission, may we begin with the lecture?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Greetings, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to whichever part of the world you're joining us from. My name is Chandani Jaswal. I'm a co-team member here at Karwa, the Heritage Exploration Initiative, and we are back with another YouTube special live lecture. Sir, I wanted to share that yesterday was a fifth anniversary of having done these lectures. So it's a very, very special day for us. And this
Yeah,
is, I think,
congratulations.
thank you, sir. I think this is the 400th lecture. We've not really counted, but we've done about 400 YouTube live lectures. So this is the first after a fifth anniversary. So it's very, very special for us. And we're very, very happy that and honored that you accepted our invitation to talk about art. And a very, very brief introduction to our illustrious speaker for tonight. Professor Brahm Prakash is a writer, culture theorist, and teaches at Theatre and Performance Studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics, Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, India. Professor Brahma Prakash is the author of Culture Label, Conceptualizing the Folk Performance in India, which came out in 2019, and Body on the Barricades, Life, Art, and Resistance in Contemporary India, which came out in 2023. His research interests lies in regional and cultural performance traditions from northern India, with a special focus on the question of aesthetics, marginality, and environmental and cultural justice. Dr. Prakash is the recipient of the Dwight Conquer-Good Award of the Performance Studies International and was a Charles Wallace India Trust Fellow in the year 2019 to 2020. Professor Prakash's articles have appeared in Asian Theatre Journal, Theatre Research International, and several edited volumes. He also writes columns on culture and politics for The Wire and other reputed newspapers and platforms throughout the world. The title of the YouTube special lecture tonight for us here at Karma Heritage is Body on the Barricades and its Aesthetic Aftermath. Professor Prakash would be speaking to us for about 40 to 45 minutes. And as is our usual norm, we ask you and we request you to put your questions and comments in the YouTube live stream chat box, and we will take those up in the Q&A session. And now, without further ado, for the moment we've been waiting for, I now hand it over to Professor Prakash for the lecture. Thank you very much again, sir, for accepting an invitation, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chandani. And I really feel honored to be part of Karwa because I know I keep reading and keep hearing some of your, talks that you keep organizing on many of those, academic or non-academic kinds of program that you keep doing that. And I also would like to thank Kisan because I think we have been planning this talk for a long time. And for first we planned this talk for cultural labor, but again, somehow we could not it could not work out. And then in the meantime, my second book has come. So it is called Body on the Barricades. And that is what I'm going to discuss with you today. And so, of course, I have done a series of talk around Body on the Barricades. And the most interesting part for me is that, now not necessarily I am reading this book the way I have written. So it largely become that how people are responding to the books and how people are reacting to some of those ideas that I have tried to generate in this book in this way. So it also becomes very interesting because generally when you write a book, then you really don't want to read it again. This is a general you can ask many academics, and I think they all would have these kinds of feeling. But I think this book is doing something in terms of writing. It does something in terms of connecting with people, and they all are reading quite differently, and that gives me energy to again and again participate in this talk. So so of course, many thanks again for inviting me. And I'm going to discuss two parts. One part would be largely about Body on the Barricades, but also some of the questions that it brought, or some of the questions that also I am now reflecting after this whole writings or whole responses from the readers in that way. So one that we can say that when I'm talking about Body on the Barricade, it's a book about many things. It is about poetry, it is about lyrical prose, it is about urgency to connect with the people, because I also come from a street theater background. And in a street theater background, many times you go and try to connect with the people. So what has happened between that, I was not able to do a street theater. That was one of my passion, and because of different kinds of curtailment. So usually Delhi has completely changed, and it was becoming difficult to do those kinds of experiments in theater. And therefore I had this whole despair situation, that how I'm going to again connect with the people, how I'm going to again connect with the audience. And perhaps this writing became one of the provided me one of the alternative ways to again do something. So it's also, I will say, that it's a strict modes of writing. It is not academic writing in that way. And therefore wherever I feel anger becomes part of this writing. When many times I write, perhaps I write through the bodies, many times I write through different kinds of gestures, and therefore it becomes more mobilizing writing. Because I have also written, like in my previous book, Cultural Labor, when I was writing, then I was writing trying to pull, follow up some kinds of academic protocols. I was trying to do some kinds of anthropological sorts of writing, and that was a book about, largely about theater and performance, from more empirical ways of thinking about theater and performance. So I was taking very concrete materials from Bihar and different parts of India to talk about some kinds of marginality, some kinds of aesthetic formation that was shaping the aesthetic regime of our time, or before that way. But here, not necessarily I'm talking about theater and performance. Largely, towards the end of the chapter, I dealt with, one, two, some examples of Habib Tanvir. Otherwise, I largely don't talk about theater and performance per se. But I would also say that how theater becomes a mode of thinking itself, because theater becomes a topography through which I try to write this book. And therefore, inherently, it becomes a theater thinking. So one way of saying that I'm not necessarily, this is not a book about theater. This is book about largely curtailment of cultural sphere, curtailment of certain kinds of expressions that I talk about. But again, I will say that a street theater becomes a mode of thinking itself, where you are trying to engage with others, where many times you are engaging with, the authorities. Many times you also try to engage with your own participant. Many times you are trying to engage with your own collective, and that becomes a modes of writing. So I try to break the all sorts of language. So, and also I don't come from, that kinds of a English medium background where I was trained in a proper grammar and that kinds of protocol in that sense. And therefore writing has been always a kinds of big challenge for me. And therefore, I was always struggling with this whole mode of writing, that how you're going to write, how people are going to read. And usually I get two kinds of comment, very extreme kinds of comment. One, that you don't know how to write, and second, that how beautifully you write. And then that also gives you very strange kinds of feeling, that either, and therefore when I'm trying to write, then I'm writing from the limits of language itself, I would say. Because once you are, so not necessarily I'm trying to follow the grammar, not necessarily I've been trying to follow the kinds of a structure. I sense some kinds of musicality in writing. I try to sense some kinds of rhythm in writing. I try to connect those writings through some kinds of energy and some kinds of bodily thinking in that way. So that becomes a, so for me personally, this was some kinds of experiment in writing itself. Something that I was feeling suffocated with academic sorts of writing. I wanted to come out of those sorts of writing. I also had this whole aim to how you're going to connect with the wider audiences, wider section of readers. And that that this writing or this book has provided me that kinds of a space where perhaps I got a sense of satisfaction, where I can say that yes, I was able to come out of these kinds of some kinds of academic encroachment, or some kinds of very structured way of thinking and writing. So am able to carve my own ways and think like that. Of course, this is not only a book, like one book which dealt with the questions of COVID-19 or the suffocation that we are witnessing, some kinds of curtailment of minority rights or curtailment of different other sorts of spaces and things. There are many books. Then I would say that why nobody on the barricade perhaps becomes a different, or it provides some kinds of other kinds of approaches, and that is what we can discuss. So So this is one is that this is profoundly about writing. It is about writing, exploring your own self, your own suffocation, your own sense of breathlessness, and that becomes one of the personal exercise for me. But in a way, because I was also writing about the themes or the issues that was emerging at a point of time, because largely the book was written near the height of COVID-19, and that was the period I was writing the books. And then I started with writing in some newspapers, some media platforms, and then suddenly, again, because you are not sure that what exactly audience or readers are going to perceive your writing. But suddenly what happened that, I was started getting some kinds of interesting response when I started writing popular in popular kinds of columns, and that also emboldened me to expand those kinds of writing. So many times, many of those essays have appeared before in a very short format. It was like 800 words, many times it was 1600 words. Then I tried to expand those essays to 6,000 words or 7,000 words, because many times in this short format, we are not usually able to explore many themes. And that was also some kinds of things that was happening in my mind, that is there a possibility to explore these themes further. So when I discuss either the question of migrant laborers, crisis of migrant laborers in relation to dance, or when I discuss about the question of mourning in relation to curtailment, then these all essays came as some kinds of provocation. Later I tried to expand those essays to also to make some kinds of analysis. So there are two ways. One ways of seeing this book is, this is a book of essays. It has 8 essays. All essays are separate. But other ways of seeing that book also becomes independent book in a sense, because all the themes are very much connected in that way. It is also patchwork, because when many times you have this whole sense of originality, that you are providing some original argument and things, that has been also kinds of some kinds of academic claims and things. But because many times you are bringing whole disparate writings together, you are bringing disparate elements together. So for example, I teach theater, dance, and theater and performance studies at the School of Arts and Aesthetics at JNU. And then I tried to bring the figure of dancer and figure of migrant laborers together. So it was very uncanny connections. What happens when you are trying to make this whole uncanny connections? And that is what also book does. So what happens when you are trying to bring the figure of dancer and figure of migrant laborer on the basis of movement? Because I think that becomes primary identification both for dancer and for the migrant laborers. Both cannot have that identity without the movement. Both of their identity depends on movement and some kinds of mobility. Uh, Sorry. And again, the argument that I make, that is there a possibility to push these boundaries where no, you are trying to identify some figures. When we think about dancers, then we think about some questions of movement. But if you are trying to use the methodology of dance figure of the dancer or figure of the dancer to examine the question of migrant laborers who are also constantly dancing from city to village, from cities after cities, then I think it becomes a very it provides some kinds of interesting kinds of framing for me, or provides me some kinds of interesting kinds of connections. Same way, recently I was thinking about that, the way that whole lynching gets a stage in a street in our contemporary time. So can we see lynching as a art installation, work of art installation, in a very provocative way? I know that I'm trying to forge very very provocative connections, but I think that also creates some kinds of reading, because why art has to always seen in a kind of idealized way? Why music has to always seen in romantic ways? Because music in your society, in our contemporary time, if you music is bringing a lot of violence, if Hindutva pop can bring that kind sort of violence on bodies, on minorities, then why we need to only talk about some kinds of valorization of music in an ideal way? We necessarily need to also talk about some kinds of violence that comes with the music, violence that come with the art, violence or installation that becomes that becomes some kinds of theme of thinking itself. And these are the connections that I try to bring across the book, and this is the way I will say it provides me some kinds of methodology of some some kinds of conceptual framework that inherently comes from theater and performance studies background or some kinds of artistic background. But at the same time, there is also relation that one can see in terms of social formations. So they both the both the categories that looks very disparated do not remain that disparated if you're thinking in that sense. Second, not second, but again, moving after also, it is also about some kinds of bodily thinking, because many times you have also whole ideas about when we write, we think that we are going to bridge the gaps. You have this whole notion about that holistic approach to the scholarship. I think that book very much takes this idea about partial, no, I'm making partial claims. I'm not saying that I'm going to bridge the gap. I'm not saying that I'm going to provide you holistic knowledge. This is also very personalized modes of thinking. It's a very evocative modes of thinking where one is trying to provide some kinds of partial thinking to understand our own atmosphere, to understand our own crisis and things. And one of the fundamental questions that was happening both at a personal level and collective level, that in the height of COVID-19, we all were feeling completely going through a lot of crisis, and it was a situation of extreme curtailment. Still, the situation has not changed much, but again, there was a situation of despair. People were feeling desperate. They were feeling despair. They were in the sense of they were becoming very, very passive. Then one of the things that book does, that it talks about very extreme kinds of curtailment. For example, it talks about curtailment of mourning, what happens when you are not just trying to curtail protest and resistance, but you also have a state authorities. They are trying to now curtail mourning, death celebration and all the death kinds of rituals and all those things. And then is there a possibility to think about some kinds of is there a kinds of possibility, is there a kinds of a space where we can think in a very in those, even in those extreme kinds of situation, even in those kinds of extreme moment of crisis, is there a possibility to bring some kinds of hope? Is there a possibility? So even in case of the extreme, what Walter Benjamin used the term extreme withdrawal, where things are getting in a position of extreme withdrawal, is there a possibility to think or make some kinds of political kinds of articulation in that condition of extreme withdrawal? Or one can say, what happens when you cannot withdraw any further? What happens when you cannot get pushed further? So what happens when your bodies are completely pushed to the limit? You cannot go further. Then how body takes some kinds of positionality. So, and this is a very empirical example that we can talk about. It happens in all kinds of crises. So it happens in the sites of protest, but it can also happens in a household. When bodies are getting pushed to the walls, then bodies does generate some kinds of potential. Body generates some kinds of potential, and that does something, and that becomes again a site of hope, or site of some kinds of thinking about some kinds of positionality of politics that I talk through across the book. Also, that some kinds of after thinking that I was thinking about, one, that how, for example, if you are talking about many of those figures, either we are talking about migrant laborers whose primary identity, movement becomes whose primary identity, who are constantly moving. In fact, they are they neither belong to village, and that is the argument I make, that they neither belong to the village, neither nor belong to the city. They are in a constant movement, and that is the movement that are, that is framing their identity, that is framing their kinds of configurations. But what happens when one day they either stops moving, or they decides to divert the route? And that is what was happening during the time of crisis. So of course, migrant laborers were facing extreme kinds of crisis. They were not getting food, they were getting humiliated, they were trying to they were not having any kinds of social security and things. But at the same time, in those heightened moment, or in those heightened crisis, they decided to go back to home. And that becomes a kinds of political questions for me. Once you decide, this was perhaps the first time, or maybe one can say primary kinds of engagement, where they are deciding in a very in a deviant ways. They're becoming a deviant figure who are deciding that they will go back to home, whatever is going to be the repercussion. Even if you have to go die there, even if I'm going to die, or if they are going to die, then they will go back to the village and die there. So it was not like some kinds of romanticization with the village that they wanted to go back. It was just some kinds of assertion that was coming in the kinds of pushed condition, in the kinds of pushed situation, and therefore again that becomes a kinds of political kinds of figure articulation that I talk about. What I will do that because the book is largely about reading, and I think reading brings some kinds of force. It is a force of reading or force of writing that does something in terms of lyrical thinking or bodily thinking. So I think the people generally, when you are trying to engage with this book, then idea would be to read it out. And what I'm going to do in the whatever time now we have left with, that I will try to read out some parts for you to give you a sense of that how one is thinking or how one is trying to think through the body itself, or through that kinds of primary engagement of muscle or gestures for that matter. So this is my first part, and I would like to start with that part. So, and then it was COVID time. I was also having COVID. Almost I got 3 times COVID, and then I was also going through that kinds of crisis. And then I'm also trying to write this book. So it was April 2021, ghastly month for India. The second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic ravaged the nation like tsunami, moving so fast that before people could grasp its reality, they were in its grip, yearning for life and gasping for breath. While working on this book of essays, I took out the virus. The moment came for me too. The breathlessness suddenly became raw and real for me. Like a live wire, it entered my nerves with an oximeter attached to my fingers and thermometer on my tongue. I too felt the urgency of life. Moments turn into events when you start counting every breath. You count the heartbeat, you count your pulsating veins, you count blood vessels and bones. You become vigilante of your own body. You never know when lungs and bones can turn white or black, when blood will turn into water and disappear from the body like a vapor. You keep checking if the skin is changing its color. Devoured by the virus, you check that your eyes are not turning black. You are still see, you are still think, you are still register, you are still register. And then so many times, so I give some kinds of very empirical examples, or some kinds of examples, or some kinds of sight that we were witnessing or that we were facing that time, but how to also give some kinds of analysis, also how to excavate some kinds of conceptual kinds of framing for those things that was happening. So it also intersects some kinds of philosophy at a very basic level, but also it brings personalized kinds of narratives. It brings different theater kinds of thinking. It brings artistic kinds of imagination to formulate this whole idea about that how body and how body can how body generates its own kinds of potentiality. In the urgency of life, the body takes all the attention. It takes all the forms. It takes all the shapes. It takes all the tall. You read like a fish out of water. You crawl like a worm, making all kinds of shapes. You move slowly like a Japanese Buto dancer on a bed. You feel blockages you have never felt. You feel the openings you have never thought. You see the thoughts you have never seen. Out of fear of virus, you check everything. You clean the broom and sanitize the sanitizer. You bath the water before you take a bath. When fear enters our psyche, we become suspicious of everything. We suspect everyone. And then, how we can just imagine the COVID situation where things were it was suspicion. It was more than anything. It was suspicion. It was the fear that those fear and suspicions were getting accumulated, and that was shaping our relations with the social, our relationship with each other. And I think that is coming here in those terms of writing. But what about others? The questions that fundamentally ask, but is this something new, or this is also very much part of the social that perhaps we don't want to see, or perhaps we have tried to ignore until now. And therefore the questions becomes very, very fundamental. What about the others? What about the sanitation worker? What about the sanitation workers who work in the sewers? There the suffocation does not come as a surprise. The pandemic is a life they live every day. Indignity is a general condition of living, and being choked to death is the most common bulletin of dying. Breathlessness is a general condition of life. They already live in a quarantine map. When they are born, their birth is marked. When they walk, their bodies get marked. They carry marked bodies through life and death. Every day they walk into quarantine zone. So what was looking very like, a strange or very like different for us during the COVID time. But again, that like, that system or that kinds of like, condition already exist in our society for like many sections of the so like communities, and therefore how we are going to think that. So whether like COVID was something very new for them, or they are witnessing COVID like situation on everyday basis. So one way of saying that this is a book that takes a lot of examples from COVID-19 time, but also this is not book about COVID-19. This is about COVID like situation that can happen without COVID, that can happen in extreme conditions of curtailment, that can happen in extreme condition of repression or extreme condition of fear and suspicion. So this is a book about COVID-like situation, not necessarily about, it takes COVID as a metaphor, but it also draws a lot of examples from the time of COVID-19. Then I also try to connect that how this again. So one way of thinking about, I'm talking about making some kinds of commentary about how this was unfolding at a societal level, but how it also unfolds at an artistic level. What are our like thinking about dance, how we think about choreography, how our classical dance have been like classical dance has been conceptualized, how they have been like structured. And then I give those examples and I would like to read out from that part. Curtail movements. We are talking about some kinds of curtail movement, choreograph movements in that way. Curtail movements create choreographic patterns. They enter the bones and become part of the muscle memory. Sometimes keeping bodies on the barricade, sometimes hiding behind the barricade, they learn to walk. Caste society has produced perhaps the most conscious act of walking for women and the outcasts. One must be aware about social status while walking. They not only define the social rules, they also govern the aesthetics rules. Indian aesthetics text, the Natya Shastra, prescribes how the lower caste and women should walk, what should be the gates of the lowly people. And I quote Natya Shastra, this is just a translation. People of inferior worth, it says, quote unquote, persons of inferior worth are to walk with eyes looking around, protecting their limbs from the contact of the other people. And then I make this argument that how restrictions are embodied, movements are marked in relation to social position. They are marked in temple walls, instilled in schools, installed in institutions. They are in a social codes, in the walks, gates, and grids. They carry this internalized prescription in their eyes, and we have been always told they will stare at you, but keep your eyes low. And that becomes again some kinds of choreography. So how I again try to bring some kinds of dance imagination or dance thinking to talk about the very structure or performance of the body or performance of the social identity that we witness in everyday life. The curtailment of movement has slowly cut the bone. They limp when they walk, they cripple when they move, they cannot stand properly. It breaks their backbone every day. They have been walking a curtail walk. And we can talk about larger section of the society or some kinds of minoritization in that way, where like almost to be like we need to see that how people are walking, and that also how that also defines our idea of the freedom, our idea of the movement, our idea of like space making itself. So, and then I connect all these things to this whole idea that what is this book about then? How I'm trying to, when I'm saying body on the barricades, what does it mean? And then it is about thinking in extreme condition of how body generates some kinds of potential in extreme condition. And therefore, it's a body on the barricade is a book of essays on the curtailment of life, art, and freedom in contemporary India. It is about situation that stands at the edge, one stands at the margin. It also shows how politics and aesthetics are coming to corporeal level, entering our psyche, and psyche playing out on our bodies and mind every day. We start thinking from the barricades in a situation of extreme vulnerability. It is a situation in which we enter the state as non-possumus. We can't return. We cannot yield anymore. It's the limit of concession after one cannot surrender. And this is the point I'm talking about, that okay, you have been getting completely pushed. You have been like, you cannot like go further. Then what you will do? Then I think again, this is the moment I think again we can talk about some kinds of precariat protest of the precariat or like resistance of the precariat, where like even in the situation of extreme condition, one can do something, or like people are doing many things. So in this situation, we risk a spaces. We are aware that if you move a step ahead, the authority may shoot you down, but two steps will can bring life and freedom. So this is the moment. This is like, and therefore, like barricades becomes very interesting and like kinds of positionality. One, that you know that if you're going to cross the barricades, you are taking the risk, but you also know that if you're not going to cross, you cannot talk about life and freedom. So that becomes a basic and necessary kinds of condition in which I try to talk about the relationship between body and barricades. Body and the barricade is about thinking about life and freedom from the points of confinement. When you have like many writings that will talk about the points of freedom, that how you're going to theorize some kinds of formation from the points of freedom. But again, primarily engagement in this book has been how to talk about the body and like that kinds of relationship from the points of confinement. It is about the act of breathing from the point of breathlessness. It is the ultimate resolution of the body to cross the barbed wire. It is the situation in which we cannot breathe, but we breathe. And that becomes the things that you get like suffocated, you feel that, oh, you can't breathe. And therefore you breathe constantly, breathe more. And that becomes also some kinds of excavating the idea of the hope, or excavating some kinds of idea of the politics itself. And then I would like to move to the chapterization, that how I have this chapterization. What are the chapters? We have 8 essays, or I can say 8 chapters, through which that structure this book. And then first chapters is called when we can't breathe. This is the called first chapter title is When We Can't Breathe. Discusses the situation of breathlessness, which is profoundly physiological as well as political situation. It discusses the situation vulnerability and its immense mobilizing capacities in which every limb tries to act in the defense of life. So not necessarily you are doing or thinking through this meditation, or you're thinking through some kinds of strategies or tactics. But again, I think in that kinds of extreme condition, what happens that every limb starts thinking, every limbs of the bodies start responding to that kinds of curtailment. And in that way, we can say that every limb tries to act in the defense of life. At that moment, what matters is not the lockdown, but the deadlock. And I think that because when you are thinking about some kinds of temporality, then it's about not the lockdown, it's the deadlock that really matters. And therefore, that becomes the kinds of questions that I try to engage in the first chapter. The impasse, it becomes some kinds of impasse that irritates us and motivates us to participate in action. This chapter, the first chapter, discusses the impasse between hope and hopelessness, because that is what becomes the very irritating part, that you are alive, you are still trying to get out of the situation, but you're not able to get out. And that becomes an impasse, that becomes a deadlock situation in which this chapter tries to create or excavate some idea of the hope. Then I move to the second chapter. Second core chapter is largely about, talks about the curtailment of the words, and it's called words and demagogues. It discusses the curtailment of words by the culture of demagoguery. So one, that we are seeing that how authoritarian regime or some kinds of demagogue are trying to curtail our words. And there are many demagogues now, and they are trying to curtail our words. But we are also becoming increasingly becoming the part of some kinds of demagoguery culture, where we cannot think about dialogue. There is no species of dialogue. It argues that curtailment of the work and the lynching of individual body are not separate acts. Because many times when we think about lynching, then we think about that, okay, this is the lynching, but it is the scenario of the lynching. And we can talk about many kinds of examples across the world, where before the lynching happened in the streets, it was first, before that, the words were already curtailed. The words was already have been attacked in that way. And then, so it shows how demagoguery command through the monologues and sees the very healing capacity of the words. So the questions that I raise in this, chapter, that like whether, like many times we think that words are immortal, words cannot be curtailed down, or words cannot be crumbled down. But we have many examples, either we are talking now, thinking about the term republic, or we are talking about some kinds of bhakti. We can just see that how those words have lost their kinds of very deeper meaning and deeper significance, and therefore we can say that how demagogy culture also curtail the words, and before they cut the bodies they definitely curtail the words. And we have examples from this Nazi era to now Zionist era, that we can talk about, that how words are getting first, their whole provocation happens through the words, and then the attack and assaults comes through the, and therefore the lynching of the acts, lynching of the body, and lynching of the word are not two separate acts that we can talk about. Sorry, I'm getting some noise.
Sorry, sir. Please proceed.
And then, so this was the my second chapter where I talk about words and demagogues, that how demagogue or demagoguery cultures are trying to curtail the meaning of the words, or how they are doing some kinds of colonization of the words, where you are trying to impose completely alienated meaning, completely dry meaning of the words, and that becomes a kinds of so either we are talking about Sabda of Kabir, where Kabir will talk about Sabda as a Jiva, that how every words have their own kinds of life. And then not necessarily when we are now thinking about the meaning of the words, then it carries that kinds of life. It becomes the annihilation of the life itself. And that is the chapter engages with the in relation to the curtailment of the words and attack on the bodies. It talks about words and demagogues in that relationship. And then the third chapter, I move about. In third chapter, I talks about what is happening to the how minority rights are getting curbed. So either you are now talking about some bill that getting passed around work food and things, or this is already started with the anti-CA, NRC protest, in these kinds of act, where there is a deliberate attempt to minorize a community. There is a deliberate attempt to completely erase their histories and their struggles in that way. And then thinking through, then I bring a lot of my own personal examples through, where so I come from Bihar. I talk about my own school days, where so I the question that some kinds of argument that I make in this chapter is that of course now the things are becoming getting very in a heightened mode, where the things are becoming very, very provocative, but it has perhaps the longer history. This has not started with this regime only. So I give an example, some of the examples in in this chapter, that for example, I would like to give 2 3 examples here. So I say that in my life, I have written more essays on cow than love letters in my life. Same way I talk about that, okay, how we used to mark attendance in a school, a small village school in Bihar, and the attendance will be marked as roll number 1 Bharat Mata Ki Jai, roll number 2 Bande Mataram. So we already have this kinds of culture that was getting proliferated, that was already creating some kinds of facilitating some kinds of cultural sphere. And now when we are talking about curtailment, then this is not something new that we can talk about. So even in that extreme curtailment, I talk about own my family kinds of engagement with the minority community, how they think about minority community, what happened to those relationships, how relationships are breaking down, and that becomes the crux of that chapter, where I talk about curtailment of minority rights in relation to curtailment of different other kinds of proliferation of some kinds of culture that has been very much part of our that kinds of geography, or that kinds of cultural making. And then I move to the fourth chapter, and fourth chapter is about talks about figure of migrant laborers and their plight in the light of curtailment of bodies and movement. Migrant laborers neither, and the argument that I make is that because I remember when COVID-19 was happening, then you suddenly had whole valorization of the village life, that oh, village is the real savior and they're going to save these migrant laborers. But perhaps in opposition to that, I make an argument that not necessarily that is the case. Migrant laborers neither belong to the village nor to the cities. They are called Pardesi at home and Pardesi outside. And if you go to like many parts of Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, which supply huge number of migrant laborers, so that is the case. When I go back to my village, then like called Pardesi Babu aa gaye, but again I remains Pardesi even in Delhi. So neither they belong to the village nor they belong to the city. They are called Pardesi at home and Pardesi outside. They are constantly on the move. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the authorities expected them to stay in one place or move in an assembly line, but they drifted from the designated routes. And that they undertook a walk that showed both the vulnerability and potentiality of their movements. So, and that is the argument that I make, that this was the first time, perhaps maybe it has happened several times in history, but this was the rare occasion where a migrant first time decided to go back to home with their own decision, not necessarily under some kinds of economic or political compulsion. And therefore that was a kind of pure political decision, or pure thinking about the life through which we can think about the question of migrant laborer. And then I move to the fifth chapter that discuss about this whole idea about very tenuous relationship between art and the state. And when I think about art and the state, then I talk both art and I take art and a state both as some kinds of idealized entities. So for example, when you are thinking to a state to remain, and I they draw from Gugiwa Thiongo, Kenyan scholar, who will write about this whole conflict, fundamental conflict relationship between art and a state. And to remain art, a state to remain as a state has to have some kinds of regulation. It has to maintain some kinds of boundaries. It has to maintain some kinds of legality. But art to remain as an art has to break that boundaries. Art to remain as an art has to go out of that kinds of legality. Art to remain as an art has to surpass that kinds of boundaries, and therefore the conflict becomes very, very fundamental. And I think thinking through, when Barbara Rao was getting arrested, we know that many artists of Kavi Kalamans, they still remain in prison. Then we know that how, why it is they are becoming troublemakers for art, troublemakers for the state and authorities. And what could be the fundamental relationship through which we can talk about this relationship between artist and the state. And so this becomes a chapter where I discuss about this whole it's trial of the poets, how trial of artist, and how trial of artist is one way of saying is that not very exemplary in that case, but other way of saying is that trial of an artist or trial of poets are very different, because it is a fundamentally an attack on sensibilities. Because when you are attacking somebody's or some citizen, of course that is also attack on some kinds of sensibilities, but it is about not about your state is trying to attack or assault the individual in that way, but there is no attack is primarily coming because the person is poet or person is artist, and therefore it is about some kinds of curtailment of art and the spaces of freedom that one can talk about. And therefore it is primarily an attack on the kinds of senses in which this chapter talks about the relationship between poets, artists, and the state. And then I move to the sixth chapter that will talk about largely about the farmers' protest. And then largely when you have a lot of reports that has come. But I also believe that if you are dealing with epic tragedy or epic kinds of crisis, then I think we need to necessarily have to have epic kinds of writing response, because fact is not enough, statistics is not enough. So you need to have more poetic and epic response to make that kinds of response. And I would read towards the end I would like to read out some section from that, from farmers protest, or that it's called color of the protest, from the color of the protest part. And then finally I talks about, in the final chapters I talk about curtailment of mourning and death ritual, that one can think about. We can all ask fundamentally that, okay, a state or authorities get enraged why when you are trying to protest, where you are trying to speak out, but what kinds of problem they can have with the observing mourning ritual, what kinds of issues they can have with the death ritual, that itself is considered the last ritual in that way. But again, we have seen in the case of Hathras, Hathras case, we have seen in many parts like the Telangana case of Telangana, Kashmir, that many times mourning itself is getting curtailed. So what is this whole idea of curtailing the mourning? And then also, and this also shows that how from biopolitical model we are perhaps lead, like many times the state authorities or this kinds of authoritarianism enters into some kinds of necropolitics where they are also not allowing you to observe mourning. You are not allowed, they are not giving you the spaces where you can have dignified death. And that becomes again a kinds of issues that chapters discuss about. And at the site of mourning and vulnerability, the epilogue, the last part, shows the possibilities of resistance and the fundamental of life and art that cannot be curtailed under any circumstances. And then in this towards the last, I give example of Habib Tanvir, and this is again a kind of a very examples. So when I was doing my bachelor degree, then Habib Tanvir by the time was like a very old, or we used to had a theater group in JNU, Bahroop, and Bahroop was observing his birth anniversary that time, and he came to speak on this was just after the Gujarat riot, so perhaps 2003 or 4 he came to participate in that meeting. And then he started the meeting, spoke something, and then he said that I like dictatorship. And then there was a whole rumor in the hall. There was a whole uneasy kinds of atmosphere in the hall where and then he had a big pause, long pause. And then we were not able to comprehend that what exactly he's saying. Somebody was saying that he has gone senile, he's not able to make sense of the politics, what is unfolding in Gujarat and things like that. And then after a long pause he said, so I can do my theater. And this was the force of theater through which we can think about. So one that I want dictator, and then he elaborated that how can you think about theater without dictator, the figure of dictator or figure of police or figure of that kinds of authoritarian state. Theater is going to be very very boring. Art is going to be very very boring, and I think that becomes the force in this time where when we are witnessing a lot of crisis or extreme kinds of crisis, how on the aftermath of Gujarat riot, if Habib Tanvir can say that I love dictator, I want to have dictatorship, so I can do my theater. Otherwise, theater is going to be very, very boring. And therefore, I think it is also some kinds of protest and resistance that keep our life flowering or to keep giving some kinds of newness to our life and things. So one way of thinking about that, this is not that one, this does not mean that one is asking that okay, that becomes the reason that a state and authority should suppress us and oppress us. But again, even in that kinds of condition, you have writers, you have artists, they keep talking, they keep writing, and they keep mobilizing some ideas and some kinds of belief in that kinds of for the people and to make some kinds of idea of the politics. So I would like to read out two more parts, and I think then should we I think we will get the time. But yeah, let me read out two parts. So in one part, I read about when I talk about some sense of breathlessness, then I'm talking about the sense of collective. That when how breath, the question of breath itself can bring the notion of collective. And then I write, we will gather like a bees. We will gather like a bees. In the simplest sense, we is I and you. It is I and you and you and you and you. We is the idea of coming together in body and words, in alliances of bodies and promised words that form a collective. But we is the problem here. Perhaps it is the most fundamental problem of politics. It moves between the possibility and impossibility of marching together. It presents the challenges of coming together. They say, and a lot of discourses now, and for a long time now, they say a collective is impossible. It is all fractures, it is all fragments, it is all false. It is futile exercise, and thus it is impossible to build solidarity. But that is the challenge. Of course, there is no easy way out. One has to be suspicious of we when one speaks on your behalf, but we also reminds us of our shared humanity, our community, our deep emotions that connect our emotional universe despite all the fractures and holes. And then finally, I would like to read out one part from Farmers Protest. And with that, I would like to end, but let me read out that one. Yeah, so the section is called The March of the Mustard. And then, yeah, so it's a March of the Mustard. Mustard was blooming on the barricades, marigolds were dancing on the border. So it's also like, some ways of bringing some kinds of lyrical modes of writing to reply to this extreme kinds of condition, extreme kinds of situation, because again, the fact is not enough. Concrete kinds of ideas is not enough. So you necessarily need to create epic, you necessarily need to create alternative kinds of myth in this kinds of scenario. So mustard was blooming on the barricades, marigolds were dancing on the borders. The kernels of maize has found the kernel desired in the alliances of bodies, full of red and green, yellow and cream, in orange and black, they were back. The protest brought to back a full-blown smile on the faces that a state had stolen from us. They marched from Amritsar, Jalandhar, Patiala, Moga, and Taran Taran. They came marching like the march of the forest in Macbeth. As Burnham would have marched to the Donciana Hill, the paddy field marched to the Raisina Hill. It was an exchange of roses and marigolds on the border, red met orange and green met blue. Paddy field danced with the water cannons and bodies with the batons. They came marching with the banners and flags, with legs and legs, in pagri and salwar, in paisama and tura, and then I go on. But again, I'm not saying that this does not mean that many times the question also came that, but again, you also have like, many disgruntled group, or maybe like, Dalit questions were not raised in the farmers' protest and things. So I agree with all the kinds of criticality. But at the same time, it is about some kinds of positionality of the poet, positionality of the artist, through which I'm trying to generate some kinds of hope, generate some kinds of idea of the life itself. And that becomes the crux of the way that one can talk about the things. And they marched singing the song of Sant Ram Udasi, Ma Dharatiye Teri God Mein Nanhu Chand Bichhere. O Mother Earth, in your lap there are a million moons. They marched this time to cut their harvest in Delhi. And I would like to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Prakash, for this very, very illuminating and thought-provoking lecture. A completely new take on how we understand and perceive art. We usually think of art as something which belongs to the elite people, something which one may never be able to afford, let alone be able to understand. And through your lecture, you've shown us that not only is art available to popular people, it is also speaking to common people who may or may not be elite. So thank you very much for giving us a new definition to art. We'll straight away head to the questions, sir. We have about 10 minutes and we have received a couple of questions. I'll read those out to you. Question says the audience wants to know, your concept of the body on the barricade is deeply evocative. How do you see your work in dialogue with older traditions of protest literature and political thought in South Asia? So there's another part to the question. Should I read that out too?
Yeah, maybe two questions we can take together.
Yes, sir. Does your framing build upon or depart from how bodies and resistance have been imagined in, say, Dalit writing, revolutionary theater, or even anti-colonial literature?
Yeah. Yeah, I think both of the questions are very much related. So one that I quite agree, like I'm saying that one that like we can think about more conventional protest, and like a protest where like, you think about, when we think about a strike, we think about workers a strike. And then there is a chapter on UNA strike. It's called Siege Against the Siege, where I am talking about UNA strike. So then how we are going to read UNA strike for that matter? And I think that will exemplify the case that what exactly I mean, how there can be possible kinds of dialogue between conventional modes of protest and new modes of protest that is also entering into the field. So in UNA strike, what has happened that you have workers, and workers who were not necessarily formalized workers who were not signed the contract. They were not the workers who were on the payroll and the signed contract, but the relationship was more formalized. One way of saying is that the relationship was not formalized because they were coming from informal sectors, but the relationship was more formalized, more deeper, because they were coming from caste society. In caste society, this relationship of workers and whoever the owner is are more formalized in that way. So it was a more ritualized, formalized relationship in which these workers were participating. So largely the conventional scholarship will not recognize these workers as workers. They will say that, oh, but again, they are not payrolled. They not necessarily participate in a strike. They cannot participate in a strike because they are not in a formal contract. But if you're thinking through other channels, from the caste society channel, from other channels, then the relationship is very much formalized. Second, what they do in this when they participate in protest. So they are stopping the work. They said that, okay, cow is your mother, you do the last rites. We are not going to clean your seat. We are not going to clean your garbage for at least for like 15, 20 days, whatever. It was a very short time of a strike that happened in Una of Gujarat. But again, what they were attacking. So one, that they were attacking the administrative offices in a very physical mode, but they were also striking the very notion of divine. And this is where I will say how the Una strike was able to expand the very notion of a strike. So Una strike very much one can think that in the larger history of the workers' strike, Una strike was a very much like workers' strike in that way. But at the same time, how coming of the new subjectivity, how coming of the new ideas in a specific cultural context, Una strikers, largely the Dalit communities, were able to give a new kinds of new dimension to the strikes, where you are not just striking in against the factory or against some kinds of very concrete kinds of buildings, but you are also striking at the level of divine. And that becomes very, very crucial that time, and that perhaps becomes very efficacious. If you're thinking about the efficacy of those strikes, then it was not about because they have stopped the work, because they were attacking the notion of the divine, Hindu divine itself. And I think that becomes the crux of the matter. So I don't see necessarily in complete separation or complete departure. I also see, yeah, of course, there is a departure, like if you're thinking in terms of subjectivity, but also there is a possible dialogue that we can think about. So I think we need to see in a kinds of like more in a dialogue and complexities in that way.
Thank you, sir.
I was able to answer the question.
Thank you, sir. Sir, we've received another anonymous question, and the question wants to the audience member wants to ask you. You write powerfully about the role of protest and art in reclaiming space and asserting life. Do you see a risk of resistance being aestheticized or symbolically celebrated, especially when systemic change remains elusive? How do we, as scholars and citizens, hold to hope without romanticizing resistance?
Yeah, there are two ways of thinking about these questions. One, that if you are a social scientist, then I will say that you can be very, very calculative, and you can say that maybe as a writer, as a poet, I am trying to not to aestheticize but poeticize in that way. I try to idealize the notion of protest and resistance. But I think it is also about defense of life. It is also about defense of protest. It's also in the time of crisis that where I'm writing. So if you're going through very empirical concrete empirical examples, one can say that, okay, the situation is not really great and we should not ideally participate in protest, or we should not ideally like romanticize this idea of the protest and resistance. But I think as a poet, as a writer, as an artist, I have this primary role to also romanticize, to also idealize, to also create some kinds of hope. Because I think whether we are successful or not, and I don't think we can measure out that success also, that notion of success also. But I think even in the primary defense of the art and life, I think we need to have that kinds of hope. And we can talk about Gil Ombit will talk about that. Either you're talking about Kabir, either you're talking about Sant Ravidas. They were thinking about Begumpura in the time of feudal period, like very different kinds of period. And but they are able to imagine the Begumpura. So I think we should not stop imagining Begumpura, but we should be also careful. We should be also conscious about what exactly, when we are talking about protest and resistance, what we are talking about and what exactly we are trying to bring out. So as a social scientist, I will say that yes, I have that apprehension. I agree with your apprehension. I agree with your cautious positions. But as an artist, as a writer, as a person who believes in a kinds of power of theater, I can also say that this becomes a primary engagement of a writer, to keep generating the hope. You keep excavating the hope. You keep excavating the imagination of the life in different ways possible, even if it is romantic or even it is kinds of idealized position in that way.
Sir, I had a question related to the question that we just got. When we look at 1857, one of the first things that we taught in undergrad school is to see, not look at it as the first war of independence, but to look at it objectively. So, sir, when colleges or when institutions are preparing students to become scholars, are we in a way taking away from that sense of, like you said, that hope that one needs to run a country or to run any institution? Are we taking that hope away when we are teaching students to become scholars? is that a necessary evil for all schools training people to become scholars, or is it something that happens once you start reading that you become more objective and more untrustful of what is happening around you?
Yeah, so again, these are the all very complicated questions. So I'm not saying that like people who are asking the questions are right, wrong in that way, or I'm right. I'm saying that this is also like modes of engagement that where we are participating in. So see, like coming from I teach the courses on myth, rituals, epic festivals, and things, and many times I feel that history is not the answer to myth. To answer your questions, one that this was like one way of like it does not mean that history is not doing its job. It does not mean that history has its own ways of working, its own kinds of methodology, its own kinds of framing. But you cannot also put history against the myth, because a myth can mobilize. Myth has the power, like it is a different kinds of signification that work. And therefore, like maybe you keep talking, you keep writing in newspaper, you keep writing in the book, maybe that is not going to provide answer to the myth that we are witnessing in terms of horror and things. I think myth, to counter the myth, you also need to generate the myth. To counter the utopia, you need to generate the utopia. To counter the history, you need to counter history also. And therefore, they all have their own modes of writing. They all have their own modes of engagement, not to deny their power, not to deny their validity. So, of course, in history class, if your teacher is saying that, okay, this is, you don't assume this way, I would agree with the teacher. But at the same time, I would also think that how communities are getting mobilized, how communities believe in certain kinds of belief, and they are like completely mobilized, and perhaps we are not able to counter those like like myths. And therefore we also need to constantly like come with the myth, with the art, with the kinds of aura also to counter, because otherwise I don't see other way around. And therefore, like when we talk about some kinds of a sphere, then I think how Bhima Koregaon can be part of history, but Bhima Koregaon was also able to create some notion of myth, some kinds of aura, some kinds of like utopia. And I think necessarily we need to go at the level of utopia to counter these kinds of mythification that is coming from very like right wing or that kinds of authoritarian kinds of politics.
Thank you, sir. So we have two more questions, but we are at the top of the hour. With your permission, can we have that
Yeah,
five?
please. Yeah, I would love to hear. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. So the next question says, you draw from figures like Kabir and Varavara Rao to assert the centrality of art in liberation struggles, but in a climate where artists are often co-opted by market forces or liberalized institutions, how do we distinguish between disruptive, radical art and art that simply decorates dissent without unsettling anything?
Okay. And can you also read out the second questions?
Yes, sir. So this is another question. Much of your critique focuses on the state's appropriation of language through monologues, misrepresentation, and semantic violence. But in an increasingly digitized protest culture, how do you assess the efficacy of language and art in confronting power today?
Okay. So I would like to read out to answer the first questions, that is about like appropriation of art and how like let me just try to find out. Hmm. Sorry, I'm getting, I think, yeah. So all right, I'm not able to find that paragraph that I wanted to read. So of course I address the questions of like how you have like artists who are getting co-opted, who are like very much part of the state institutions and things like that, and nobody is denying that. Also, like whole market forces is very much working in favor of those artists, and you don't have, I will say that you don't have many alternative spaces to think about think independently and bring that kinds of very ideal notion of art. But at the same time, it does not completely evade, and that is the whole idea about like thinking about art and culture, like some kinds of cultural production, that one, it can get regimented, one, that it is getting very much like co-opted, but at the same time it is constantly able to generate some kinds of surplus poetics that cannot be, that always exceeds that limit, that always exceeds that kinds of boundaries. and therefore you always find the crisis. So one that time and again, this is the whole history. Like we talk about history of music. You like I was reading a beautiful book by Ted Gioia, and that is the way he's writing. That you are talking about rap, you are talking about blues, you are talking about all the history of the global the music, Afro-Asian music, Afro-American music, and then you will find that they all started with maybe the radical impulse. So at a point of time, it was having that kind of radical impulse, but later it got appropriated. What happened with the bhakti music and bhakti songs? It has started with the whole subversive ideas. Later it got appropriated. At the same time, it was also able to constantly regenerate themselves in many ways. And therefore, we need to see in both ways that one, that necessarily you have apparatus, state apparatus, corporate apparatus, they will try to appropriate this art, these kinds of access of the language in that way, but also language and art also have some kinds of inherent capacity to go beyond that kinds of bondage and to get out of that kinds of curtailment or containment for that matter. But I don't think was able to answer that one. Perhaps that paragraph was more I will say a specific to answer your question. So maybe I will email you. If we can, you can give me my email ID, then I think we can discuss that one.
So
The
these are all.
second part, if you can read the second question, perhaps I
Yes,
missed
sir.
that one.
Dear audience members, you can of course put your questions anonymously, but if you would want to have a further follow-up, please leave it emails in the chat box, and then we'll forward sir's email to you, and then you can have a one-on-one connect with sir.
There,
This
there was something on digital things that I missed out. So if you could read out like that one.
Yes, sir.
Hmm.
Sir, it's the last question, which says much of your critique focuses on the state's appropriation of language through monologues, misrepresentation, and semantic violence. But in increasingly digitized protest culture, how do you assess the efficacy of language and art in confronting power today?
Okay. Hmm. So I'm not sure if I can answer these questions because of course things are getting digitized and many new kinds of platforms are coming up, and that also gives you so many times when I think about coming of the many artist communities or many coming of the many communities as an artist, then perhaps this is also open to TikTok. I also work on Bhojpuri music and other kinds of folk performances, and I can give you hundreds of examples where many artists came through this TikTok kinds of platforms and other kinds of platforms. So these are the platforms that facilitated them, that has given them some kinds of a space to open up their artistic potential. But we also know the limits and problematics characteristic of this platform. So I think we cannot see in one way or other way. And second, that there has been a whole criticism about either occupation movement or these kinds of sit-in movement and things like that. So and then you have very organized idea of the protest. But at the same time, I think that both have their own characteristics, but both cannot be diminished for each other. Yes, farmers protest did very organized protests, and perhaps that was the reason that they were remained successful in a more I will say evaluative sense, like if you're trying to evaluate that one. But I will also say that NTCA protest or many other protests that happened was not a failure. It has its own kinds of, it was also able to generate some kinds of efficacy in a different ways, coming together, making an assembly in this time of crisis, in the extreme kinds of curtailment itself generates a lot of hope and efficacy. So I think perhaps that our evaluation that to what extent movement is successful, whether protest was successful or not, perhaps I don't think that is the right questions. If you have done the protest, you have done the history, you have made the history. And I think that maybe the can become fundamental kinds of idea. In that way, we need to think about it is not the evaluation in a pure sense that we can perhaps have that kinds of argument.
Thank you very much, sir. We've already taken too much of your time. And thank you very much for agreeing to the extension. For further questions, please email us at karvaheritage@gmail.com, and we'll forward your questions and comments to Professor Prakash, and we'll get back to you. Till then, please join me in thanking Professor Brahma Prakash for his time, for his scholarship, and for his patience in dealing with all our questions. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation and for taking up all our questions so very patiently. Uh,
Thank you so much, Chandani, and thank you so much, Isan, Karwan, and all people who could participate and could have your for patience hearing for the work that I try to share with you. But let us have this constant engagement and constant dialogue, and I think this is the greater hope that we can have.
Thank you very much, sir. We couldn't have said it better. We'll see you next day, audience, on Sunday with another Karma YouTube lecture. Till then, good night. Have a good day, everybody.